Okay, so like I said, the original research that was created by that was conducted by the University of Georgia turned into this really big scholarly report. It was close to 100 pages. And so we knew that this was going to be kind of difficult to digest for a lot of people. We wanted to create more of something that was visually appealing and that really drilled down into the important findings and recommendations of the research. So that team consisted of course, like I said, Ocean Conservancy spearheading it, a lot of different organizations, many of you in the room who contributed in one way or another. Thank you for participating. And then the New Materials Institute at the University of Georgia, which is also known as the Jambeck Research Group. That group is led by Dr. Jenna Jambeck. She is a waste genius. Those of you guys who are waste nerds like me, Jenna Jambeck is like a rock star. We had her at the Ocean Conservancy Shores Forward Summit a couple of years back, and we were all just like fangirling out that she was there. And she walked us through a lot of the learnings of the CAP. So I wanted to have her be the one to walk you through the framework that is the CAP. So I have a quick video to show you.
The Circularity Assessment Protocol, or CAP, like we like to call it for short, is a hub and spoke model. And what that means is there's 7 components that we look at in a community. And the 7 spokes are input, so input of plastic and materials into a community. And we looked at shops and stores and restaurants for that input. Our community assessment, meaning we look at people's knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions around plastic. And then third, we look at product design. How are the packaging and materials that come in to provide people with goods designed? And then we look at use. So use and reuse. So is there more single-use items, or are there items that people can reuse to get their products? And then we look at collection of materials or waste in a community, and then how it's managed at its end of life or end of cycle. And then the last component is leakage. And that means we look at what ends up on the ground. What kind of litter is leaking out of this system? The first thing I want to do is say, in nature, there really isn't a waste produced. So sort of every output in nature is an input somewhere else. And so nature is also a complex system. Our cities are complex systems. So how can we move closer to what nature does and not create waste in the first place?
Amazing. So thank you to our rock star, Jenna Jambeck. You may actually have also heard of her, as she's widely recognized for being the person leading the team who figured out that it is 8 million metric tons of plastic that enters the ocean every year. If you've ever heard that data point, that was researched and established by Jenna's research group. So we were so lucky to have her and her team come to Miami. And it was the first time that a study like this has been conducted in an urban city in the United States. So it was truly a groundbreaking effort, not only to have her team here, but to look at this very specifically in the city of Miami and within its boundaries. So again, as Jenna mentioned, these are the different spokes of the model: input, community, product design, use, collection, end of cycle, and leakage. And so we'll go into each of these individually. But as you can see here, why this is important, and specifically for Miami, is because when you look at Miami's waste generation rates as compared to the US, we are 61% higher. So we're at 7.9 pounds of waste per person per day being generated, 16% of that being plastic, and as opposed to 4.9 pounds per person per day, with 12% of that being plastic. So when you look at how that correlates to the city of Miami's population, which is 470,000 people and continues to grow annually, that computes to 3.7 million pounds of waste per day, 1.3 billion pounds of waste per year, and 216 million pounds of that being plastic. Just mind-blowing figures. don't know why that's happening. Okay, here we go. So as we dive into the model and we look at input, what Jenna's research team did is that they went around and actually went to different grocery stores and markets throughout the entire city. And they assessed all of, not all of, but most of the products there in these ones that they visited. And what they found was that the manufacturers and parent companies of these products are largely located here in the United States, which I found surprising. So you can see kind of the median distance from store to the parent company here, even with the highest median, which was tobacco products, that still potentially comes from the United States. And we can see that 76% of the parent companies were here in the US. So this means that federal laws and policies can govern the products that end up here in Miami. Then as we looked at community, there were a significant amount of resident surveys and also different stakeholders that were interviewed. So this included politicians, it included business owners, and of course, residents. And we all know here, right, that we have a really significant problem with education here in Miami when it comes to waste. People people struggle with knowing what it is that they can and can't recycle. And in some cases, they don't care or they haven't, made the effort to learn this for themselves. So there is an opportunity to build awareness to the connection between individual behavior and the health of our environment. So since we know that, I didn't dive into those details here, but I did want to share the resident survey results, as this might help inform any of the work that you're already doing and how you speak to your audiences, or hopefully people that you come into contact with that do need a little bit more education on this. So some of the drivers of change and transformation that were cited was simple and easy means of acting, responsibility for future generations, and belief and determination that this can help solve problems. Motivations for sustainable behavior were the environmental, community, and health benefits. How we learn about waste management came from personal experience, experts, and media. And then I found this one interesting. Who should be responsible? The top answer was the private sector and corporations, followed by the government and politicians, and then followed by community members. Next, they look at product design. So as they actually assess these different convenience stores and the items available there, they found that so many different types of plastics were present. 6 out of the 9 categories that were assessed were plastic, and that made up 88% of this total. So we're looking at the multi-layer films. This is like your chip bags. The single films is like your, standard plastic wrapping, your PET, polypropylene, high density polyethylene, all of these different types of plastic that all come with their individual little recycling symbol and number, right? So this contributes to so much confusion in the marketplace because we all know that very, very few of these plastics are actually recycled here in Miami, and having all of these different ones available ends up creating contamination for our recycling facilities. Next, they looked at use. And so use and reuse, right, if we're thinking about single use versus multi-use items, has always, of course, reuse has always been presented as the best source reduction option when a container is needed, right? So we prefer reusable containers. But the issue here is that Jenna's team found that sometimes these cost up to 700 times more than the single-use plastic equivalent. So this creates a big barrier for lower income communities, small businesses, and different residents around the city. Then as we look at collection, of the 4.3 million tons of municipal solid waste collected in 2020, 16% of that was identified as plastic, which is 688,000 tons of plastic for the year. So not only do we have an issue with volume, but the other side of this is that many of the buildings and commercial entities that are present in Miami actually don't even offer recycling at all. So this became an issue that kind of rose to the top in those resident surveys. Many people who lived in multifamily homes said, my building doesn't even collect recycling. And then when there is a commercial contract that is sometimes required to collect recycling, those buildings don't necessarily educate their tenants, and those recycling dumpsters often just end up full of trash and going straight to the landfill. And speaking of the landfill, this is where our end of cycle comes in. So as we all know, a vast majority of our waste here in Miami, 1,300 tons per day, goes to the landfill. We do have the the materials recovery facility, which processes around 130 tons of recyclables per day, but 70% of the materials that go to the MRF are not recyclable. And so this creates contamination, which then causes the cost to go up and the profit to go down. It creates an financially unsustainable business model for the materials recovery facility. And then finally, we know we used to have the incinerator, which was helpful, at least from a volume reduction standpoint. But unfortunately, we all know what happens there. It was incinerated. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the fire that happened at the incineration plant eventually just shut that plant down, and we cannot rely on that anymore. So I know that we might have some other organizations in the room who are coming up with these amazing creative solutions that also come in for end of cycle, right? So we might have Lady Green Recycling in the room, or we might have Compost for Life, or some of the other organizations who are working on developing these operations, and we're so grateful for them. But at large, the city has really only adopted the landfill and the materials recovery facility at this point. And then finally, leakage. So what's ending up in the environment? How is it getting there? Of the 10,000 litter items recorded, so this means that Jenna Jambeck's group actually went throughout the entire city and picked up and assessed over 10,000 pieces of litter. And 4 of the 7 categories, making up 69% of that litter, was made of plastic. So we're looking at those categories of plastic fragments, food plastic, which is your single-use plastic bottles and styrofoam packaging. We're looking at other plastics and PPE. All of those amounted to 69%. And then when we look at the litter collected at beach cleanups, which I believe Debris Free Oceans provided this data, it was 97% plastic. Next, they also kind of combined the data sets around the litter that was collected and the population density of the different neighborhoods where it was collected. And what's interesting is that as that population density went up, so as you went from single family to multifamily to mixed use neighborhoods that are more, more dense, the plastic percentages also went up. So you'll see that plastic fragments went from 15% all the way up to 35% in those mixed use neighborhoods, which is where we have kind of commercial and residential, kind of like your downtown Miami, Coconut Grove areas. So our takeaways here from just the research are obviously that plastic is a problem when it comes to Miami's waste issues. Plastic appears and in droves in all of those different phases of the life cycle. But solutions are here at home because a majority of the manufacturers and parent companies are US based. Education is key, so Miami's residents are highly unaware or misinformed about how to reduce or manage their waste, but that presents an opportunity for us. Access is an issue, so not everyone has access to recycling collection at all, and then when they have access to sustainable alternatives, they might come at much higher costs. Circular infrastructure is hard to come by here. So wash hubs for reusables, compost facilities, other types of recycling, while might be some smaller operations happening, the city has yet to adopt those. and our natural resources are taking the hit. The correlation between the products that are released in our city and what we find in our environment is undeniable. But all hope is not lost. So this came from a 2014 scenario that was selected by the Miami-Dade County Solid Waste Advisory Committee. So we've had this information available to us since 2014 in the county. And the number one solution, of course, is source reduction. Let's just bring, avoid the waste that we don't have to produce in the first place. But then, of course, there's other solutions, including increasing the efficiency of recycling and reuse, the landfill, the collection and transport. So all of this was already established back in 2014. But then what the CAP did is made many recommendations for other ways or supporting ways that this could these strategies could be employed. And so the exciting part is that once those recommendations kind of came to us in that larger report, then Ocean Conservancy took it a step further and made this kind of condensed report with those recommendations in them and created some community working groups to kind of assess the report and prioritize those recommendations. So I wanted to actually invite, since Danny Padilla is on this call and he was the person who was spearheading, I'm going to put him in the spotlight and let him tell you a little bit more about how those working groups were formed.
Hey Viv,
Hi.
can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Sorry if I'm off camera, guys. I'm solo parenting today, and so I'm juggling 3 different things at the same time, but it's really nice to be here. As Viv mentioned, when I was in the Florida conservation team at Ocean Conservancy, I was spearheading the efforts to actually roll out the CAP. And so when we were working with Viv on rolling it out, we wanted to make sure that it was accessible, that it wasn't going to just live within the technical kind of pages of the CAP report. So we did make this condensed version that you see the cover for here. So I would encourage you to reach out. I believe we have it in 3 different languages. I think it's in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. So it is available. Please do reach out. So when we actually launched that, we launched it with a press conference with Mayor Suarez. So it was important that we got it in front of eyeballs, really, right? So making sure that people knew about it, making sure that the politicians know about it as well. When we were working with UGA to actually collect the data, one of the things that I was keen on was that we needed to make sure that the data points that were collected for the transects, for like where the litter was, represented all 5 commission districts in the city of Miami, therefore spoke to the political boundaries of Miami. And so in the report, you actually have that by commission district. And then from there, the idea was, well, okay, if this is data that now has an academic kind of backing to it, we then need to back it up with residents in Miami and see if all of this is like ringing true. And so we put together a working group facilitated by Ana Zangrones, who is the extension agent for Sea Grant in Miami-Dade County. And we recruited residents from all over city of Miami represented. We were able to get folks from 4 of the 5 commission districts. We had Spanish, Haitian Creole, and English represented. We did have simultaneous interpreting and translation of all the materials. We also went through visual, like we had a architecture student draw summaries for all of the meetings so that we can capture all of the takeaways for all the meetings. And what we really asked and we tasked the working group with doing was, 1, become super familiar with the CAP. So they reviewed the condensed report, they reviewed the data, no small feat by any means, and then really prioritize. So out of all of the possible solutions or opportunities that the CAP highlights, what are the ones that speak to you the most? Which ones are speaking to you per your neighborhood, and are those different? And then from there, we asked them to figure out what are the top items that they wanted to have action on, because we expectedly saw that depending on where you were from Miami, you saw different priorities, and so it was a really funny game of voting at the end where we I think we had to vote maybe 3 different times for folks to finally identify the priority action items. And the working group was it was marvelous. It was really, really, really fruitful to actually pick the things that will carry the most amount of water from the cap and the report, and then really put it into action and just try to make sure that it keeps going up. So that was done over the course of, I want to say, over 3 months. And Theo, who's on the call, obviously you've heard from Theo. He's going to walk you through the action guide.
I believe the link to the full action guide was dropped in the chat, so definitely feel free to check that out. But what I'm going to do now is walk you through those recommendations that Danny mentioned that the working groups prioritized. So there were 7 recommendations in total from a broader list that came from the CAP itself and from some broader discussions around the results. So I'll walk through those 7. They're broken up into 3 different categories to kind of help better understand where the actions can be taken. So first is social actions, which is something that the residents, the greater members of the Miami community can be involved with. There's government actions. So what can the city of Miami as a city government do? And then third is civic actions, which is a little bit of a combination of the two. So some of this is, within the city's power, but the help and support of residents and of community members really help bring some of these things over the finish line. And before I dive into some of these, I just really want to mention and reiterate that the importance of the working group and the insight that was gained from that to be able to find these recommendations, it really gave us such a helpful insight into the public perception of these issues and where the needs are. So as I'm going through these recommendations, I just want to point out this isn't necessarily reinventing the wheel. Some of these recommendations are not new to people. There's already organizations in the city and in the area doing great work on some of these. It was just very helpful for us to sort of kind of take the information, visualize it in the context of the CAP, and then hopefully use it to kind of provide a helpful framework for lots of different sectors that are working on these issues. So just wanted to kind of mention that before jumping in. But let's take a look at some of the 7 recommendations. So the first in our social actions for members of the Miami community is looking at education, both in formal education in schools and also in outreach to the broader public. As Viv mentioned, there is definitely a need to be getting community members more engaged and broaden some understanding of issues when it comes to waste in Miami. So doing that through schools was something that was mentioned and prioritized. Having some formal lessons on these issues as part of Miami schools was something that was seen that could be a big help. And also just opening outreach channels through city channels, but through just broader communication across the city to talk more about some of the issues within the CAP, the findings within the CAP, and broader sustainability related content as well. Again, and there's a lot of groups in Miami doing great work on this already. So just kind of continuing this work as we move forward. But also there was a need identified to talk to boaters and tourists, people not just who live and work in Miami, but people who come to Miami and still play a very big role in the issue of waste within the city. So there was a need for folks to be having those conversations with a lot of these broader groups. So identifying ways that we can work across the city, identify where the best avenues are to open up those channels of communications to these groups is something that was chosen as a priority. But then also going back to the education piece a little bit more, recognizing that there's a big role to play for young people in this issue. There's obviously, a lot of folks here are aware that there's a lot of energy among younger generations around the issue of plastic pollution, of waste. There's a general better understanding of the issue, in younger generations. So recognizing that young people can play a really important role, not just in actions, but in also spreading the message, was something that folks in the working group thought was a really important takeaway. So finding ways that we can sort of be nurturing that that focus that younger people have on these issues, finding those individuals or those groups that want to do more and giving them that space and the resources to be able to actually take that action. Jumping into some of the government actions. So these are where we take some big jumps here in what we're ultimately trying to do. So with the city of Miami itself, one of the recommendations was to just find what the city can do really within its power to start to find what some of those alternative systems can be and address some of those most prevalent and problematic items. And a lot of that comes from just understanding who the city is working with. Companies, corporations, suppliers of a lot of these most common items. Can the city identify where those connections are, and can they start to take action? Again, within their power, obviously within the state of Florida, there's a lot at play. There's a lot of policy and legal levers and obstacles to consider. But really having the city sort of find out what are some of those first steps, the low-hanging fruit, et cetera, that they can do to start to reduce some of those inputs. Also, prioritizing the storm drain system in the city and helping people understand the role that it plays in bringing plastic pollution from the city out into the waters. And so, this is obviously a big undertaking. There's a lot that would have to go into this work. But a big part of the community focus here would be trying to also educate folks within the community about ways that they can make sure that they're stopping trash before it reaches storm drains and reaches the bay. Last two within this civic piece. So again, this kind of ties into some of the recommendations that we already talked about in terms of awareness and education within the city, but really having the city and community members come together to recognize where they can have the most impacts with different spots within the city and different communities, and then allocating the resources to help those communities start to take action is something that was prioritized. And then last but not least is actually giving or having the city allocate resources to sort of up their capacity and their capability within their waste management recycling departments to take on a lot of those different recommendations that Viv had pulled up on that slide there. Obviously, again, there's a lot that goes into that work, but having the backing and support and the mandate from the community to make sure that the city is prioritizing that is a key piece of that equation. So those are our 7. Like I said, please, I encourage you to check out the full action guide. There's more in there. There's more information about what was discussed by the working group, other recommendations that were considered. But for the sake of time and for today, those are the cream of the crop, we'll say.
Awesome. Thank you, Theo.